Picture a legendary rock night, blinding lights, a roaring crowd, and music that promised to never end. 5 names: Jimi Hendrix, Janis, Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, each a myth cut down at exactly 27. That number haunts the history of rock like a ghost no one can catch. So, is it truly a curse or just a coincidence we refuse to explain? Every culture has its secret clubs, the ones you only hear about through whispers and half-cracked smiles. This one, though, has no secret handshake, no dimly lit meeting room in some forgotten corner of the city, and no founder who ever set the rules. It's an exclusive society where membership is granted only by death, and the only qualification is that you left the world at the age of 27. We call it the 27 Club, a roster of music's most tragic talents, a term that has become a kind of shorthand for wasted brilliance. But the name itself, the gathering of all these ghosts under one banner, is a much more recent invention than you might think, a story inked not by fate but by newspaper editors. For this was not a phenomenon that was recognized as it happened, but one that was sculpted into existence years later, its shape defined by a single powerful article. In the aftermath of Kurt Cobain's death in 1994, when the world was struggling to comprehend the loss of another voice, a piece in the music press, the NME, looked back and began to connect the dots, formally listing the famous names who shared this somber birthday with him. The label stuck, and a legend was cemented, a club with no charter and no meeting place, but whose glowing embers are forever kept alive. Yet, here is the truth that those who mourn the mystery often miss. The power of this group has never been in the tragic stories themselves, but in the sheer cold weight of the statistics that make them so remarkable. On the 18th of September 1970, in a London hotel room, the greatest guitarist of his generation slipped away at 27, and the world felt the first jolt of a pattern it could not yet name. Just 16 days later, across the Atlantic in Los Angeles, Janis Joplin's voice was silenced by a heroin overdose, her raw and aching blues cut off at the exact same age. The double blow was staggering, but the cruel symmetry had not yet finished its work. On the 3rd of July 1971 in Paris, Jim Morrison was found dead in a bathtub, with the official cause listed as heart failure, while suspicion of narcotics never faded. 3 titans, 3 cities, 3 deaths, all within a single calendar year, and all at 27. How could the public not feel the cold hand of fate reaching down from the stage lights? Then came the moment that reignited the legend for a new generation, when Kurt Cobain took his own life on the 5th of April, 1994, in Seattle, and the myth of the 27 Club exploded back into the mainstream, with a power that turned a grieving era into a media phenomenon. The tragedy of these 4 lives is undeniable, and the nearness of their deaths in time created a wave of public horror that has never fully receded. Yet this is where the story demands a colder eye, because the true spine-chilling coincidence is not the number itself, but how quickly we are willing to weave a supernatural curse from threads of very real and very different kinds of pain. The British Medical Journal published a study in 2014 that approached the legend with a cool, clinical scalpel. It was one of the most respected medical journals in the world, and its researchers went looking for a curse, expecting to find evidence of something extraordinary. What they found instead was the quiet, unglamorous truth. They confirmed that rock, pop and jazz musicians do die at a higher rate than the general population, a sobering reality for anyone who has ever dreamed of a life on the road. But then came the critical finding, the one that deflates the entire myth. They discovered absolutely no evidence that the age of 27 was a moment of special, heightened danger. The spike in mortality was real, but it was spread across all the young adult years, not concentrated at that one fateful birthday. To put it into perspective, another research group looked at the careers of over 12,000 European musicians and found that the average age of death for these artists was a stark 45 years old, a figure dramatically lower than the public average. That single number reframes the entire conversation, shifting the focus from a supernatural deadline to a professional hazard. It's a completely different diagnosis, one that replaces a phantom with a pattern of risk. The real tragedy isn't a magical deadline looming at 27. It's a career path statistically proven to be far more dangerous than the one most of us will ever walk. So the same research that seems to resurrect the curse also hands us the statistical tools to bury it for good. In 2015, a study published in PLOS ONE crunched data from Wikipedia and biographical sources, concluding that musicians were 1.5 times more likely to die at 27 than the general population. Now that sounds like vindication for every conspiracy theorist who ever stared at a candlelit photo of Jim Morrison. But here is where the numbers get mischievous. Because if you look at the 50 greatest rock artists of all time, a list compiled by Complex in 2015, only 2 of them died at that supposedly fatal age. The rest scattered across their 30s, 40s and 50s, which hardly suggests a cosmic appointment. Then there is the cold arithmetic from Rolling Stone's own 2011 ranking of the 200 greatest artists, where a mere 2% died at 27. Meanwhile, a full 10% of that same list died at 56. So, by that logic, should we not be whispering about the terrible curse of being 56? That number is 5 times more deadly to rock royalty than the fabled 27, yet no one is burning incense for it. Why? Because 56 does not fit the romantic tragedy we have built. And that is the whole game right there. The 27 Club is a textbook case of confirmation bias, where we train our eyes on the small handful of names that match the myth and calmly ignore the long, unglamorous parade of artists who simply grew old. Picture a quiet evening in 1970. A young musician sits alone, strumming a guitar, unaware that within months the culture will immortalize him not just for his art, but for the exact moment his life ends. We build altars to these figures, yet the real culprit behind their early graves has nothing to do with the curse. It comes down to a single grim statistic. A 2011 study in the British Medical Journal found that rock artists face a risk of dying from alcohol or drugs that is 2 to 3 times higher than the general population. That isn't mysticism, that is a lifestyle measured in late nights, relentless pressure, and an environment where excess is practically a job requirement. Consider the heroin itself. Analysis published in Drug and Alcohol Dependence reveals that street heroin in the 1970s was only 5 to 10% pure, a volatile cocktail that could trigger a fatal overdose in both a seasoned user and a curious newcomer. Before 1980, emergency response was a gamble. A bad dose meant death within minutes, and the medical system was simply not equipped to intervene. Then there is the world we live in now. The World Health Organization estimates that 128 Americans die from opioid overdoses every single day. Think about that for a second. That number dwarfs the handful of famous names we obsess over, and it exposes a so-called curse for what it truly is. A public health catastrophe, not a supernatural one. We romanticize a tragic figure at 27, but we look away from the epidemic that is still claiming lives by the tens of thousands. Those artists died young not because of a number written in the stars, but because of the poison they used and the medicine that failed them. The cause was never a destiny. It was a substance and a system that could not save them in time. Look at the dates of the famous deaths and an uncomfortable pattern emerges. The cluster of rock star tragedies that built the legend happened almost entirely before 1980, an era when emergency medicine was a fraction of what it is today. Back then, the systems for treating a drug overdose or reviving a stopped heart were primitive, and a single street dose could kill in minutes with no reliable antidote close at hand. The medical response to a cardiac arrest on the way to a hospital in 1970 was drastically less effective than the one we take for granted now, and this brutal fact of history robbed these artists of the second chances modern addicts often receive. The disparity becomes undeniable when you look at the modern data, which shows the mortality rate for rock musicians under 30 dropped significantly between 2000 and 2019 compared to the 1960s and 1970s, according to research published in Nature Behavioral Sciences. If a supernatural curse were truly at work, its deadly efficiency should remain constant across all generations, yet the evidence shows the opposite, with the phenomenon fading as medical science advanced. The conclusion is sobering, and it finally strips the mystique away from these tragedies, because the true common denominator linking Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison was not a magical number, but the crude state of the healthcare system that failed them. We must learn to read historical data without projecting modern expectations onto the past, understanding that these artists were not doomed by fate, but simply born too early for the medical interventions that could have saved them. Just imagine what a difference a single decade of progress in emergency care would have made for them, and consider how differently we might view their legacies today. The Guardian ran a quick survey back in 2015, and what it found exposes the whole trick. The vast majority of articles about the 27 Club only ever tell the stories of the same 4 or 5 famous musicians endlessly recycled and repackaged. This creates a closed loop where journalism keeps repeating the identical names until the public starts to believe it is some kind of natural law. But here is the uncomfortable question we rarely ask ourselves. How many musicians die at 27 that we have never heard of? They are simply not counted because their stories do not fit the narrative. It was always a selective canon, not a statistical reality. That selective canon feeds directly into the way we process loss. Researchers at Psychology Today and CBS News have found that fans under 30 form an especially intense bond with artists who die young, and they call it the immortal hero syndrome. Grief becomes tangled with identity, and the tragedy feels personal even to people who were never alive to see the artist perform. It is a psychological mechanism that turns a stranger's death into a mirror for our own mortality, and the effect is strongest precisely in the age bracket that dominates music culture. So while the articles keep repeating the same names, the audience keeps projecting something deeper onto those names. And then the merchandise arrives, and the whole thing gets very strange very fast. At music festivals across England, observers have documented a recurring fashion choice. Young fans wearing t-shirts bearing the faces of dead musicians to project an image of rebellion. Sociologists have given this phenomenon a clinical label, calling it the juvenilization of tragedy. But you might recognize it as simply the commodification of grief. The ethical dilemma here is uncomfortable because the mourning is real, but so is the aestheticization of it. Nobody wants to accuse a teenager of exploitation for wearing a Nirvana shirt, and yet the line between honoring a legacy and profiting from a corpse begins to blur. None of this is accidental, and that is the point worth sitting with for a moment. We are not born with a natural instinct to worship dead rock stars. We are taught to do it through repetition, through the constant parade of the same faces, through the careful omission of every other statistic. The media does not simply report on the 27 Club, it manufactures the club by choosing which deaths to canonize and which ones to discard. And once that machine is running, it sustains itself. So here is the real lesson underneath the myth, the one that applies to every viral story you will ever encounter. First, trace the data to its source and ask who collected it and why. Second, test the sample size against the total population, because a handful of famous cases is not a pattern. Third, zoom out to the whole landscape before you accept any conclusion, since a story that ignores its context is not a discovery, it is a sales pitch. The 27 Club has always been a story of selection, not of fate. For over 6 decades, the Rolling Stones have been the living, breathing contradiction to the entire myth. While the narrative of rock and roll insists on early graves, these men have simply refused to cooperate. With the average age of the current core members hovering around 80, they have outlived every trend, every movement and every supposed era of peak danger, surviving the very decades that supposedly claimed their peers. Does this mean the curse simply forgot to check its list, or does it suggest that the pattern was never a rule at all? In fact, a counterintuitive finding from the CDC, covering the entire decade of the 2000s, revealed the suicide rate among rock artists was actually lower than that of the general public, a statistic that shatters the archetype of the tortured, self-destructive musician. The narrative insists these stars are doomed by their own demons, yet the data points to a more complicated and less romantic reality. The original members of the so-called 27 Club, as noted in a 2015 study from Oxford Academic, died from accidents or overdoses, not from a conscious act of self-annihilation. We built a legend of tragic, voluntary departure on the shaky foundation of a few select cases, ignoring the hundreds who simply lived. The curse, it turns out, is not a law of nature, but a hasty conclusion drawn from a tiny, carefully curated minority. There's a strange arithmetic to grief in the music industry, and it all runs on a single, unspoken rule. Death is a marketing strategy. According to the Harvard Business Review in 2018, public attention for an artist who has passed away is roughly 3 times higher than it was while they were alive, which means the industry has a quiet, vested interest in keeping the myth alive. The numbers confirm it. Billboard's data from 2022 shows that music revenue for deceased artists spikes by a staggering 94% within just 1 week of their death, as if the final heartbeat triggers a sudden rush of streaming. Consider the case of Jimi Hendrix, a man who released only 5 studio albums in his brief 4-year career, yet whose posthumous sales have completely dwarfed anything he earned while breathing. Do we really stop to question why we're so ready to enshrine them? Or are we just cogs in a well-oiled machine that profits from tragedy? Look at the digital landscape where TikTok's 27 Club hashtag has amassed over 1 billion views by 2023, a testament to how the legend is being actively rebuilt by Gen Z, not as history but as an aesthetic. The more we mourn them, the more their catalogues get repackaged, remastered and re-released. The more their images appear on posters and t-shirts, the more deeply the legend engraves itself into our cultural memory. It's a self-sustaining cycle. Our collective worship fuels a market that has mastered the art of selling nostalgia wrapped in a myth. So the next time you pour one out for a fallen rock star, try to ask yourself one crucial question. Are you honouring their music? Or are you just playing a role in a commercial engine that feeds on the spectacle of their exit? In the winter of 2024, a team from the University of Queensland published findings in the journal Addiction that reframed the entire discussion, moving it from the realm of folklore into the hard data of public health. The researchers found that the festival environment, with its dense concentration of stimulants and exhaustion, creates a statistically significant spike in mortality risk for music fans in their 20s. This is not a curse descending from the heavens. It is a physiological response to an environment engineered for excess. The risk is not hidden in the digits of a birth year, but in the very culture of the pit and the backstage pass. It is a hazard of the profession, not a prophecy. This leads us to a more uncomfortable and more fascinating truth. Dr. Sarah Johnson, a clinical psychologist at UCLA, argues that the myth of the self-destructive genius is not merely a story we tell. It is a brand strategy some young artists actively cultivate. The imagery of the tortured soul, of the flame that burns twice as bright, is a marketable persona that can create a powerful, if morbid, allure. This deliberate construction of a dangerous mystique, she suggests, can normalize risk-taking and keep a harmful cycle spinning. The romanticization becomes a permission slip, and the legend of the 27 Club becomes the ultimate tragic end of that particular brand of marketing. The narrative is so potent that it can overshadow the very real and mundane dangers that lurk in the day-to-day life of a touring musician. And underneath all of it, there's a sobering biological baseline. The National Institutes of Health has tracked a worrying upward trend in cardiovascular mortality for the 25 to 34 age bracket over the last decade. The heart, under the sustained assault of stimulants and the chronic stress of a performer's life, can simply give out, making an early death a tragic but logical statistical outcome for a high-risk group. So, does this mean the mystery is solved? If a cascade of environmental, cultural and biological factors can explain these deaths so thoroughly, what is left for fate to do? The data points to a conclusion as stark as it is simple. It was never higher power, but rather a perfect storm of human choices and societal pressures. Science will keep searching, but the answer has always been waiting in the evidence. By 2023, the so-called 27 Club had stopped being a piece of rock trivia and became a genuine subject of academic inquiry, with more than 50 peer-reviewed papers published in ISI-indexed journals examining its psychological hold on us. What began as a tabloid coincidence is now studied with the same seriousness as any other mass cultural phenomenon, which tells you something about how deeply we want it to be real. But here is where the story takes its most revealing turn. A 2008 study from the University of Tokyo found that most Japanese people had never even heard of the 27 Club at all. Think about that for a moment. If this were a true curse, some universal law of nature, it would not respect borders or languages or oceans. It would strike down musicians in Tokyo and Seoul and Lagos with the same merciless precision it allegedly showed in London and Seattle. Instead, the phenomenon is almost entirely confined to the cultural bubble of Britain and America, a localized accident of celebrity culture that the rest of the world simply didn't inherit. That alone should tell you that we are not looking at a supernatural force, but at a story we tell ourselves, a story that only makes sense within a particular cultural context. So why do we cling to it so fiercely? Why do we prefer the mystery over the mundane explanation? Because the human mind is wired to find patterns, even where none exist, and a curse is a far more satisfying narrative than a series of unrelated tragedies. We want the world to make sense, and a tidy explanation, however false, is more comforting than the chaos of random, meaningless death. This need for narrative extends to our collective memory, and a 2016 analysis from the University of Cambridge found that Twitter users post far more often about dead artists they love than about living ones, turning grief into a shared, global ritual. We gather online to mourn together, to trade memories and favourite songs, and in doing so we keep these ghosts alive in a way that feels almost sacred. There is even something quietly devotional about the hour we choose to do it, because Spotify reported in 2021 that listening to artists who died in their 20s and 30s spikes by 33% between midnight and 3 in the morning. That is not a statistics blip, that is a candle lit in the dark, a private pilgrimage made by thousands of insomniacs who find more comfort in the voices of the dead than in the silence of their own rooms. But here is the question we should all ask ourselves before we get lost in this beautiful haunting mythology. When you listen to Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin or Kurt Cobain, are you hearing their music, or are you hearing the story of their death? Are you drawn to the art, to the tragedy that ended it? The greatest trick the 27 Club ever pulled was convincing us that these two things are inseparable, that the music means more, somehow, because the artist died young. But that is a lie we tell ourselves, and it is a lie that diminishes the very people we claim to honour. The truth is that their art would have been just as powerful if they had lived to be 80, and their deaths added nothing to their genius except a layer of melancholy that we have mistaken for depth. So the next time you catch yourself romanticizing a young musician's demise, stop and ask what you are really mourning. Are you mourning the songs they never got to write, or are you mourning the aesthetic of a beautiful tragedy? Because one of those is a genuine loss, and the other is just a story we have been telling ourselves for too long. That night, under the coloured lights, the music felt eternal, but now you understand the stage was also a minefield. There was never a curse, only a convergence of real tragedies, real occupational hazards, and an entire industry that learned to monetize the grief. We should remember Amy Winehouse, who joined this so-called club on the 23rd of July in 2011, not for the way her story ended, but for the voice that poured out a lifetime of pain in just a few albums. Her death, like the others, was a public health tragedy dressed up as folklore. Unlike decorated soldiers or prominent activists who receive official memorials, a musician's passing is often left to be processed through the raw, immediate channels of social media, which is precisely why this ghost has survived so long in our digital culture. That spontaneous global mourning we participate in online is powerful, but it rarely tells the whole story, reducing complex lives to a single morbid headline. So let us shift our focus from the mystery of a number to the reality of a life and honour the art they left behind, not the circumstances of their exit. If this perspective has shifted how you hear those legendary tracks, share this video with a fellow music lover who still believes in the spell. Drop a comment telling us which artist you will now listen to with fresh ears, and subscribe for more explorations that pull back the curtain on the stories we think we know. The next time you hear that age mentioned, let it be a reminder of their brilliance, not a superstition, a tribute to the music they gave us, not a eulogy for a myth.